Well, we got green eyes, and we got you with the greenback. And, as you might expect, we're going to talk about money. But not in a traditional sense. We're going to talk about something called the Federal Reserve. And apparently, there's a lot of agreement between folks across the political spectrum about the Federal Reserve. And I'll let James introduce that subject matter.
Thanks, Dave. First of all, I'd like to ask you if you have any kind of revelations about your personal life you'd like to lay on us before we get into political stuff.
You guys are bad.
Before we get to the boring stuff? No? All right.
My life is just calm as could be.
Just checking, okay.
Except for, no, go ahead.
Yeah, money. What I want to talk about tonight is the Federal Reserve, as you mentioned, and the part it might have played in the recent political crisis, economic crisis that we're in, the recession and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
All right. All right.
Are we off?
Okay, I'm sorry.
Continue.
No, Dave.
Continue,
do you want background on the...
Yeah, give us some background on Federal Reserve, a little bit of a timeline, and then we'll talk about the generics, the specifics and the generics of the issue, and how apparently it relates across political and social lines.
Okay. The Federal Reserve, a lot of people have heard about this. It's in the news a lot. A lot of people don't understand what it is. Let me just say first off, without sounding like I'm giving some rhetoric already, right away, Federal Reserve is not federal and it's not a reserve. Mm-hmm. And it's very important for Americans to understand exactly what it is. It's actually a private bank, which I think would surprise most Americans. It's not really part of the government, and it's really behind a lot, if not all, of our problems, especially the economic problems.
So when people complain about the government and complain about the issues of the economic issues, it's maybe the government is the enabler, perhaps, and it's the Fed or the Federal Reserve that's behind?
Yeah, it's kind of like almost a sick cooperation sometimes. Mm-hmm. But let me give you a little history. We didn't always have the Federal Reserve. Mm-hmm. In the past, way back in medieval times, the government there weren't taxes as we know them. The government would sort of had a much more limited economic activity, but what it would do is it would solicit services. Let's say they wanted a road built. Mm-hmm. They'll build a road, and they would just create money, the government. They didn't go to any bankers necessarily. This is England, for instance. Yeah. And they actually gave out sticks, what they were called tallies, believe it or not. That's where the word tally comes from.
Oh, okay.
And it was just understood. It was called money by fiat. They would give like a stick out, and they said, this is as good as a currency. It means proof that you did a government service, and they can be circulated. And it worked pretty well in a medieval context. Mm-hmm. Basically, a few centuries later, you're getting around to maybe the late 17th century, it reached a point where governments were getting into bigger and more expensive wars, and they needed more financing. And rather than go this route that worked, they were talked into by international-type bankers, not necessarily domestic bankers, into kind of giving up their whole financial deal to the bank. The governments had gotten into debt, and basically these bankers, these parties said, look, you're going to your debts. We'll cover your debts. But what you're going to do, you're going to let us print money. You're going to let us take over the printing and banking of money, which was a pretty sweet deal. And this was kind of done behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. This is the same system which has lasted until this day, except now this private bank is quite international in nature, is called the Federal Reserve.
Okay, do you want to talk about it on a national basis first and then go to international, or talk about it in the context overall of international issues?
Let's stay on the national issue because I think it's of primary importance to most of our viewers. Mm-hmm. This English system basically came to dominate the U.S. system. A turning point was 1913, but prior to that, it was a battle fought. It was not established, and there were many Americans who were warned against this type of bank. Private bank running the currency show, running the money circulation show. And the battle wasn't totally won by the private bankers, the Federal Reserve, until about 1913. There were several. Mike, do you have a question?
No.
Oh, okay, sorry. And there were several incarnations of this bank. It was a real battle early on. There was one right after the American Revolution. Andrew Jackson managed to get one voted down. He was a big enemy of this. Mm-hmm. For all his faults, he saw the evils of this type of banking system. moving forward to the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, let me explain what the alternative to the Federal Reserve. We circulate what is known as, these are dollars, and we consider this a national currency. It's not really a national currency. This is a Federal Reserve note. It's really printed. It's actually the government prints it, but it's actually distributed and banked by the Federal Reserve.
Is it kind of more like an IOU, maybe?
It's kind of an IOU. It gets complex. Things used to be backed by gold. They're not anymore.
Yeah,
that's a whole other show.
Yeah.
But basically, the point I'm trying to make is this is not really from the U.S. government. It's from the Federal Reserve. And let me reiterate if I haven't said this. The Federal Reserve is a private corporation. Most of its stock is held by private banks, the bigger banks, such as Chase, Manhattan, Citicorp, which have been in different guises and different names, the main banks in this country since the beginning of the country.
Yep. Okay. Goldman Sachs, Jeff had mentioned also. But now we've got the chart here, and we've got Federal Reserve, and we've got U.S. Treasury. What is the difference between the Federal Reserve and U.S. Treasury? Are they two separate entities?
Basically. That's a hard thing to understand. It's kind of technical, and this is dry, too, I understand, but it's very important. Economics is called the dismal science.
Okay. No doubt.
Anyway, this is the Federal Reserve note. It's not really put out by the Treasury. However, this was attempted at several points in history, especially during the Civil War. During the Civil War, the expenditures from the Union side were so high that the banks were drooling. They wanted to lend the government all this money, Lincoln all this money. It would have given them control of the government for the foreseeable future. But Lincoln tried to avoid this by printing greenbacks. Now, these dollars, Federal Reserve knows as greenbacks too, but they're not quite the same.
Yeah.
Initially, the greenbacks were actually a national currency. Lincoln just printed them up. He wasn't borrowing. Typically, what would happen previously is the government, believe it or not, would borrow from the Federal Reserve. They would have gone into debt to this private corporation to get the money they needed to prosecute the war or for whatever reason.
We'll talk about corporate influence over government.
Right. What a sweet deal. But it's not really necessary. As it turns out, a lot of people don't understand this, and it's been proven that what the government can do is actually print the money itself. It doesn't necessarily have to borrow it. When we borrow it, that ends up being a debt for everyone. That's why we pay taxes. So a lot of it goes towards paying off that debt. Also, it gives these people in the Federal Reserve and the private banking world tremendous influence over the government, obviously. They're lenders. The government is a borrower. It's in debt to this. So again, the alternative would be for the national government just to use the U.S. Treasury, not the Federal Reserve. The U.S. Treasury is different. It's not the Federal Reserve. The U.S. Treasury is actually under the government control and is theoretically an instrument of the people. They can print the currency. Real, true national notes. And that's what the greenbacks during the Civil War were. They worked really well. They did become slightly inflationary towards the end because they were being speculated, because counterfeiters were running them. The British agents also were probably printing them to try to, it was like economic warfare. But the inflation, any inflationary aspects can be controlled. And it's absolutely no reason. And the benefits of this system are really startling. If the government is allowed to print the money rather than the Federal Reserve, it could make federal income tax much less or even totally unnecessary. Because if you think about it, if the government's printing the money, the government can also lend the money directly. Okay, the government can draw interest. The government can make loans at reasonable interest rates. The interest would go back into the public coffer. Imagine that. All the interest payments that we make now, which sucks everything dry, which caused this recent liquidity crisis, which plunged us into a recession. All those interest payments would go into the public coffers. Imagine that, and are recirculated. So that would it would get the government out of debt, get us all out of debt, which has all kinds of benefits. It would make the government, much less subject to the influence of the Federal Reserve, and thirdly, I mean, obviously, just be a lot more money. It seems so simple. It seems ludicrous. There must be a catch.
It does seem rather uncomplicated. Is the Federal Reserve another layer of bureaucracy within
It's beyond
without our government?
Bureaucracy. I mean, these people have managed to increasingly do their operations in secret, which is never a good thing. So it's hard to keep track of them.
No transparency.
Less transparency. And ironically, during the last fiscal crisis, the last couple of years, this most recent financial bill that was passed, which was a good effort by the Obama administration, considering what they're up against, really actually gives more power to the Federal Reserve and gives them lets them call the shots. So let me just reiterate this, and I don't want to be repetitive. Let me explain again. The Federal Reserve is not part of the government. It's not us. It's almost like an external agent I don't want to get too rhetorical here. It's parasitical. Okay, they don't have the interest of the people in mind. That's not their function. It never has been. They are a bank. They are a bank for profit. Now, over the years, they become part of the government in little ways, superficial ways, if only to make it look better, to camouflage things. But again, let me reiterate: the currency can be printed through the government, through us, not through the Federal Reserve, and it would just solve a whole lot of problems.
One of the important points I think that you made off camera was that this concern about the Federal Reserve is not a political concern. It's you expressed it as being something that
they're outside our not to interrupt. They're outside of our political control. This is how bad this is. I mean, these people are appointed by a board full of insiders. I don't know what their tenure is, like Bernanke. Ben Bernanke is the current head of the Federal Reserve. But they're in there for a long time, a long term. It might be indefinite. And it really has nothing to do with the voters. Most people just don't understand this process. I mean, I read a lot, and I have a hard time wrapping my head around it. But again, you have to understand they are really outside the control of the people. And for an organization with this kind of control over the economy, and these people set interest rates, they control currency, the amounts of liquidity. And again, they're very tied in with the major banks and everything with derivatives and all that business. For them to be outside the control of the citizen is really mind-boggling. It's really startling and disturbing.
We've heard all kinds of complaints from folks that I guess we would not normally see as being partners in terms of politics with us. But I think what the point you're making overall is that really, in fact, we all should be together on this issue and work together to try to resolve this issue.
This show, Progressive Soup, usually has leans to the left or whatever. We're progressive politics. We're for distributing the wealth. We're definitely progressive economically. We're for, again, spreading out the wealth and government involvement if that's necessary. But this issue of the Federal Reserve is also pretty popular with tea-baggers from more conservative groups.
Tea Party members,
Libertarians, Okay. In fact, I saw I couldn't believe it. I saw a newspaper, a little printed newspaper out in the lobby.
Right in the lobby
left by one of the more libertarian shows here, explaining the same thing. So this really, as one of our director, Jeff, likes to say, this is a top-bottom issue, not a left-right issue. It's just really just clear-cut injustice and inequity.
And you identify the Federal Reserve as really not even being us. It's this thing out in left field.
I've been repetitive on that, but it's really hard to get your mind about.
It's a point well taken.
Yeah.
That the Federal Reserve is something that's outside of our control as voters, and yet wields quite a bit of power and saps off interest payments, which comes to them from lending money that they really don't even have to lend.
That's right. That's another thing. All the money the Federal Reserve, these huge banks have, and this became clear in the last few years, doesn't really exist. The banks make their profits by what's called fractional reserve banking. They only need to keep a small fraction. What you give them deposit, they can lend out 10 times over, and it just multiplies. So you end up with a big pyramid scheme. Most of the so-called money in our system, in our economy, doesn't exist in cash at all. It's just on the books. It's imagined money or almost make-believe money.
I think the concept of a pyramid scheme is pretty clear to everybody who's seen things that are pyramid schemes, where those at the top of the rung make all the profits based on the work of the folks that are distributors in case of
That's the way things
Amway
work. That's the nature of the beast, Dave, but it's worse than that, because this money doesn't really exist. In fact, you could even go so far as it's called a Ponzi scheme. The whole thing, our national economy.
So they take our money, lend it back to us, and get paid.
Exactly.
To take our money and lend it back to us.
In this most recent crisis, it gets worse. What actually happened, try to wrap your mind around this. These people, basically, the Federal Reserve is tied up with all kinds of speculation, short selling. They gambled our money away. Okay, listen to this. The banks go bankrupt, but these banks have gotten so big and influential, if they went down, it was conceivable they would take everything else down. So what we do, listen to this, they're bankrupt. We borrow money from them. We sell them T-bills to raise money to lend back to them to keep them propped up. It's mind-boggling.
It really is, and
And there's an alternative, as I said. The alternative, and it's been done before in history, the state of Pennsylvania in colonial times, Ben Franklin called this whole situation with the banks. He knew what was going on. He called it the impossible contract. Because he knew basically interest charge, compound interest, basically outstrips the money supply. So eventually, within a few generations, everyone's in debt and controlled by the banks, and that's what's happened. And the only way to avoid this, again, is for the government itself, the people, to print the money. And they did that in Pennsylvania, and it worked very well. They had a land bank there, and Ben Franklin would go over to Europe. The Europeans would ask, how do you have such a good economy when you don't have that much money, you don't have that much gold? I mean, how do you keep it going? And Franklin explained this system. The Europeans, who were used to this central banking as opposed to national banking, which we have, they had the central, again, Federal Reserve type bank. They couldn't believe what he was saying, that it could be pulled off. But it can be pulled off, and it's been proven in other instances in history more recently. It's been proven overseas, which we can get into in another show.
Yeah.
So done in Malaysia and Argentina. But also, as I said, it was done here during the Civil War. Before, again, after the war, the bankers, those interests, they got together and managed to squash it. Because, again, it was outside their control. Lincoln's greenbacks were outside their control, and they managed to pass legislation which eventually neutralized that. But that battle was fought until about 1913. If you read American history, you heard about the Silver Party, William Jennings Bryan,
Greenbacks.
that battle. That was all about this.
Greenback Party,
silver, and actually, believe it or not, coins, as opposed to these, coins actually are a national currency. It's a whole different deal. That is the people's money. The bankers have used the Constitution, which literally says the government has the ability to coin money. They've argued that means the government can only do coins and not bills. And they really need to get on the Constitution. It's a dumb argument, but we could get an amendment to the Constitution to say the government can print all kinds of money. But money was mostly coins then. That's the reason they wrote it that way.
Because things cost less money, and a penny counted for something back then.
And anyway, getting back to the late 19th century, silver, which was a lot of the coinage, was still the people's money.
Yeah.
And the Silver Party was against the government buying up all that money, that silver, and taking it out of circulation, because they saw that correctly as a banker's ploy, to the banker's advantage. So this battle's been fought, and it's.
And then in 1913 was
1913
was the economic version of Armageddon, if you will.
That's right. They passed the Federal Reserve Act.
Everything was handed over to the Federal Reserve.
That's right. And these people argued that they were the only real guarantee against a depression happening. And you could argue that these people caused the depressions. Okay, their speculation, their short selling, their manipulating of the money supply is usually the cause of the depressions. And then they come in and buy everything up cheap. Okay, they want to make it sound like it's an arbitrary cycle. It's not really the case at all. But that's, again, a whole other show. But anyway, by 1913, they convinced the government, and again, these issues are so complex, people can understand them then, that they were the only real guarantee for financial and economic stability. But of course, they weren't. 20 years later, you had the Great Depression.
Now, when we fast forward to the last couple of years, when we had what they call the meltdown, and what they talked about banks being too big to fail, and which was a very frightening term, and I think influenced a lot of people to giving additional money and additional power to the Fed, to the Federal Reserve. They talked about derivatives. And of course,
you could do a whole other show about derivatives.
Yeah.
Again, it's derivatives are basically side bets, in effect, on whether a commodity or stock is going to do well. These can be used as forms of insurance, but they've been abused by the system, which has become unregulated. And so, of course, they were abused, and there's just trillions and trillions of make-believe dollars and money invested in derivatives.
Well, those of us that understand differential calculus, and that's a little bit of a tough subject, but essentially you're talking about exactly.
If you understand what futures are and commodities, it's the same thing. Actually, derivatives kind of evolved from that. That was the first real derivative. Futures and commodities, they were sold in Chicago. But anyway, that's used. Derivatives are used all over the world now.
You're betting on future performance of a commodity.
Right, and it's also puts and calls and stocks are also derivatives. It's a form of derivative. But anyway, that's not real money. It's unproductive, okay? It's concluded in profits and GMP. Again, it's make-believe money. And in the end, it's parasitical.
It's fair to say, I think, that investing in and of itself, investing is kind of parasitical because there's no work that goes involved in it. There's no work in investing. There's nothing productive about it.
That's right.
When you make something or or produce something, that's something which is functional. But sitting around and pushing buttons and making, as you say, bets on what's going to happen with the people that are producing a commodity or a crop or machinery, that's...
By giving the Federal Reserve control over the money, okay, you're basically making the marketplace open for all kinds of speculation, which is usually bad. It's not in the people's favor, okay? You're opening the doors to all kinds of activity which is just based on money. It's productivity based on money, not actually making things, for instance, which produces wealth for everyone. And it's unproductive. If we switch to a national currency, thereby taking the juice away from the Federal Reserve and all their financial-based and speculative-based operations, you put the money back to work for the people. Okay.
We always like to do things on Progressive Soup. We always like to look forward and not just look at problems, but find solutions. What would be a process by which we could correct this problem? Is there a process? Is it lengthy? Is it multi-step? Is it simple?
Absolutely. Constitutionally, what the U.S. could do, believe it or not, this sounds crazy, they could print up, the U.S. government has about $7 trillion to the Federal Reserve. That's how big the debt is, okay? Yeah. They could print 7 coins and denominate each one is worth $1 trillion, constitutionally legal, and just give that to the Fed and say, the books are cleared.
Yeah.
That could be done. Believe it or not, it's legal. They could do that, and then at that point, they could take over the operations.
We'd start off with a balanced budget again.
More realistically, what the U.S. could do, for starters, they could start, for instance, infrastructure is crumbling. I mean, you talk about on the East Coast last year, you had trains stopping to New York because there's electrical problems because the electrical stations are so old.
Yeah.
Let's say you could build a whole new train infrastructure, okay? The government prints out, pays for that out of its own treasury. They don't borrow from the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
They could also infuse money into the economy, create jobs. There's no reason that can't be done. Eventually, what you could do, though, you could gradually take over the Federal Reserve. This should happen. This should be federalized gradually. You don't need to abolish it. That would scare everyone too much, even though it's possible. You basically slowly buy it out. These big banks that have gone into receivership, like AIG.
The AIG went into receivership.
The government now has a big stake in that. They had to rescue it. Just keep these companies and make them work for the people. Disallow them to speculate too much. Let them do traditional banking services. Okay, which we still need.
Yeah.
But there's no reason why the government can't retain control of them and make them, again, federalize them and make them work for the people.
So make banks do what banks were traditionally set up to do.
Absolutely.
To gather in money and to lend out money.
That's right. To circulate. Banks should be agents getting parties together, facilitating business deals.
Facilitators, okay.
They're not supposed to be freaking out-of-control monsters trying to grab money any way they can. Obviously, it's not good for anyone. It's common sense.
It does seem like a fairly reasonable, commonsensical solution to a pretty complicated mess we've gotten ourselves into.
Yeah, and again, it's sound and it's funny. This reminds me of the movie The Matrix a bit, which is a kind of overrated movie. Sorry for the Matrix fans, but the movie had some good ideas, and one of which is that reality is being imposed, and that it's very hard to break out of this. And I think if you learn about this, you'll have the same feeling that you've kind of been, without realizing, we've been trained to think a certain way. I mean, it sounds corny. But if you read into it,
inside the box as opposed to thinking outside the box and finding simple solutions, and again, that's what we try to do on the show, is find reasonable solutions to complex problems. But let's go back to The Matrix, because a lot of people, I saw the movie, have some recollection of it. Draw your parallel between the movie The Matrix and
okay, basically The Matrix, it's a science fiction film where machines in the future get the upper hand on humans, and they need, supposedly, they get their energy from energy produced by the human body. But they need to keep people alive, but they need to kind of dope them up and have them a false reality. They just want them in pods.
Yeah.
So they create this artificial reality in people's minds. They just sit in pods all day long. So people think they're in reality, but they're really in a dream for the machine's benefit. Okay, and basically the movie shows the hero basically coming to this realization and basically physically breaking out of the pod and joining a group of freedom fighters who try to take down the machines. So obviously you can see the analogy here.
It's a very clear analogy, and a lot can be said for movies. I think people ought to really look at movies and look at literature and try to draw something out of them.
And another analogy here is, let me also mention, sorry to cut you off, Dave, is I got a lot of these ideas, I'll be honest with you, from several books, but the main one is Web of Death by Alan Brown. And in that, she uses The Wizard of Oz as her big analogy. There's another good one, which people might be more familiar with, especially older people.
Yeah.
And she equates the wizard. She uses that, and she even says the original writer, Frank Baum, I think his name, was writing as an analog too. And after reading the book, I think that might have been the case. In this case, the wizard, the man behind the curtain, is kind of equivalent to the Federal Reserve or the private banking cartels.
Yeah.
And so forth. And if you think about the movie, the Tin Man is the worker, the industrial worker, and the whole journey is a journey towards truth.
You have the farmer. You have the scarecrow as the farmer.
Yeah. And there's other aspects in the two. You can see some precursors of New Age thinking and so forth with the red shoes. But you can also see it as very much as an economic allegory. So The Matrix, The Wizard of Oz are ways to think about this, because it really does get dry and boring. And I think this is a big thing. It's worked to their advantage, the fact that it is so boring. You think it'd be some kind of dramatic, we're terrorized, but actually we've been lulled into sleep because it's so damn boring.
That I think people would generally agree upon, that we tend to be subject to being lulled into a stupor and die not with a, what do they say, not with a bang. The world ended not with a bang, but with a whimper.
Right.
Well, there's a lot of whimpering going on right now. Not a lot of banging, but there's a lot of whimpering going on.
Yeah, there's some banging going on. How much time do we have? 1 minute.
Okay,
folks. Maybe we'll have some more shows on this topic. It's a sprawling topic, and it's hard to understand, but it's important. And let me add also that, in addition to printing national notes, it's also possible to print local currencies, which is another good idea.
A couple quick references to what people should Google to learn a little bit more. Just some keywords that they should Google to maybe find articles that might speak to these things.
Federal Reserve, Web of Debt is the book I cited.
Web of Debt,
that can be gotten through the bookstores. They can order that in. It might not be on the shelf, but they can order it in.
Yep.
History of the Federal Reserve. Just reading history. You don't have to read anyone with an agenda like I seem to have tonight. Just read a pure history, and you can see what a ripoff this is. I mean, just straightforward history. You can see what's going on.
Critical thinking. We love critical thinking, don't we?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. This has been Progressive Soup. Keep going.
Keep going.
Keep going. Okay.
What does China do?
Yeah. What's
They give us 7 coins.
Yeah. When China's lending us money now, how do they fit into this? Do they fit into this?
China's managed to avoid all these pitfalls. They use a currency that's more national, and it's worked for them.
That's what the complaint is about China. Is they control, the government of China controls their currency, and I think there's been a lot of griping about that. That how come they've intentionally devalued their currency?
That's right, and there's huge stories on this. I mean, across the board, Dave. I mean, in history, you can see countries that have tried to go to a national currency have been attacked. Those are the countries that have been most speculated on and had their currencies devalued by the IMF, and there's a whole other international aspect of this.
You mentioned the International Monetary Fund, and there we have situations. Most recently, Greece had an economic crisis, and we wonder, and we should look into who's behind these things and how did these things happen, and how can we stop them from happening. Thank you very much, Progressive Soup. We'll be back with more talk about this. All right.